The Cold War was not a fight in distant lands, space, or even in nuclear showdowns. It was a war in the minds and hearts of men. It was a war unlike any other war because it was a clash of ideologies, a struggle for dominance of the discourse, molding of public opinion, and sustenance of power by fear. Paranoia ran deep in the United States, as it did in the Soviet Union, and in that sense, communism and/or capitalism stood at the root of an existential threat, now visibly infesting homes, workplaces, and personal conviction. Extremes characterized measures on both sides of the divide. The American side saw governments use witch hunts, blacklists, and the most draconian methods possible to regulate people's activities. The Soviet side was marked by censorship, propaganda, and strict lines, rendering control over the information as essential as control over the arms. But how did that climate of fear shape the quotidian world? Could mere suspicion ruin a career? How could people live in a world as a whole defined by loyalty, where everybody seemed to be under constant surveillance and doubt? This was during the Cold War, when America was gripped with fear over the threat of communism. Senator Joseph McCarthy led the charge, and his systematic pursuit of suspected communists turned paranoia into national policy. McCarthyism was known to thrive on accusations rather than evidence, which fueled a culture of suspicion across the country. Anyone with left-leaning views or simply the wrong association could be labeled a Soviet sympathizer. Probably the most infamous part of this time was blacklisting. Hollywood was a battleground, and actors, writers, and directors were not hired because they had connections with communists. Even government employees, educators, and people in the private sector had to sign loyalty oaths stating they were loyal to the United States and that communism was wrong in their jobs. For the average American, it was an age of fear. Neighbors informing on neighbors, co-workers distrustful of co-workers, and overnight loss of careers. An accusation of communist sympathy could destroy a life, creating an atmosphere where silence and conformity were survival tools. Was it an overreaction to the real threat, or a political tool for controlling dissent? Here, information was an arm of the state. All media, especially newspapers, radio, television, as well as literature, came under the government's control, and only pro-communist history would appear in the media. Western influences were demonized, and any dissenting opinions were swiftly silenced. In such a world, the Soviet citizen lived, where the truth was told by the state, and his access to alternative viewpoints was almost impossible. Among the most effective Soviet propaganda tools was the cult of personality, more so during the rule of Joseph Stalin. The image of him was omnipresent, a sage, fatherly leader who, with his mighty hand, took the nation into prosperity. Historical facts were reshaped to suit his successes. His cruel purges and massacres were erased. Not even death halted the propaganda. Soviet leadership became infallible. But behind this beautifully crafted image was a society under constant surveillance. The KGB and other forms of secret police monitored citizens for any sign of disloyalty. Neighbors, colleagues, and even family members were encouraged to report suspicious behavior. A simple joke about the government could result in arrest, exile, or worse. Fear had become a way of life that would ensure obedience without the necessity of open force. The constant grip of control by information, combined with the omnipresent specter of punishment, kept Soviet citizens in line for decades. People living behind the Iron Curtain did, however, see a real Soviet reality, with the shape molded by the state alone, even if the world outside sometimes caught glimpses of Soviet power. As the Cold War deepened, the fear of nuclear annihilation slowly saturated the daily lives of people. No longer did it feel like some remote possibility that an atomic attack would occur. It was something that was expected to happen sooner or later. Governments, schools, and families prepared for the unthinkable, placing nuclear survival within the fabric of society. The most enduring symbol of this time was the duck and cover drills conducted in America's schools. Children were taught to duck under their desks and cover themselves against the lethal fallout of a nuclear explosion. Billboards and movies for kids informed them that this practice might keep them alive when the professionals in the room well knew that such an attack would be very fatal. While they created an illusion of being prepared, drills did little to alleviate the ongoing anxiety of being under the mushroom cloud. The world outside saw programs for civil defense, advising people to create fallout shelters and build food, water, and medical supply caches. Communities were encouraged to dig out neighborhood bunkers. In some areas, governments allocated funds for constructing large group community shelters. Survival books detailed how to survive the nuclear winter, and corporations cashed in on fear with the sales of radiation meters and emergency boxes. It placed upon the nuclear pursuit an unbearable psychological burden. To one generation at least, an existential threat constantly loomed at the edge of consciousness, the very real, even immediate threat of extinction through nuclear war. Anxiety sired distrust, paranoia, and in extreme forms, fatalism. Distrust often proved to be tantamount to turning away from attention toward the threat for some people. For others, however, it created a kind of obsessional fear of it. Even today, the echoes of this nuclear hysteria remain in popular culture and government policies, reminding everyone of a time when the world stood on the edge of destruction. Ideological confrontation took on a new dimension through the tools of films, music, and literature. They became an effective instrument for both the United States and the Soviet Union in reinforcing their ideologies, influencing citizens, and waging psychological warfare. Hollywood became a major actor in the spreading of the anti-communist fever. For instance, in Red Dawn, 1984, Soviet invasions of American soil are portrayed. Hence, communism was viewed as an existential threat. Dark satires like Dr. Strangelove, 1964, portrayed the ridiculousness of nuclear brinkmanship. It spoke of both fear and criticism over the politics of the Cold War. Even the James Bond spy thrillers painted the Soviets as the ultimate bad guys, whose Cold War storylines were already ingrained into the popular psyche. Meanwhile, the Soviets were using film and art to create a hero and a good history of communism and Soviet achievement. Movies were produced in the state-owned studios where Soviet heroes won, Western capitalism was discredited, and collectivism won. Paints, posters, and drama represented patriotism and obedience to the government. Each kind of media produced was intended to fit into the party's ideology. Literature and music were also involved. In America, novels like 1984 and Fahrenheit 451 served as cautions about totalitarianism, with a veiled critique of communism as much as of government overreach. Protest songs and rock music served as symbols of rebellion, sometimes challenging Cold War paranoia. In the USSR, censorship was stern, but approved books and Soviet anthems spread the message of unity and ideological superiority. Culture was more than entertainment. It was a battlefield where ideas, fears, and propaganda had shaped the minds of millions of people under the Iron Curtain. Much time has passed since the end of the Cold War. However, most of its shades of fear continue to be retained within. Several decades of anti-communist attitudes combined with surveillance by the government have left leaving profound imprint on modern politics, media, and general public perception. Government surveillance can be said to be the most significant reflection of this world of the Cold War. When the McCarthy regime was hunting down communists during the campaign for people's scrutiny, modern forms of intelligence programs were shaped to take their definite shape. For instance, through the Patriot Act, mass collection of data occurred, and an agency like the NSA engaged in digital surveillance. It thus appears that in this world, the paranoia of the Cold War lives till today. They justify the policy as enhanced national security, just like when governments feigned being afraid of communism in America. Meanwhile, the media bears the scars of Cold War propaganda. Suspicion in journalism grew because both, on their part, manipulated information to influence public opinion for self-interest. Even today, one finds charges of fake news and media bias as skepticism, sown during the Cold War years, resonate strongly. People question sources, suspect hidden agendas, and are growing increasingly suspicious of the press. Attitudes shaped by decades of ideological battles. Perhaps, however, the most lasting legacy is the Cold War mindset itself. Political divisions remain strong. Countries and people are just as divided in a world of us versus them. Even though the adversary is no longer the Soviet Union, ideological fights all continue under other names. Fear politics that were so ably honed during the heyday of the Cold War are very much alive and kicking. shaping society's responses to perceived or actual threats, ensuring the Cold War never ended, but only changed form. It never had to do with weapons and borders, but with who's in control of the minds. Fear, propaganda, and ideological warfare reshaped whole generations concerning how to view society's enemies, their governments, and even their neighbors. If it wasn't McCarthyism in America, then it was state-controlled media in the USSR. The competition for dominance stretched far beyond politics and seeped into daily living, education, art, and one's thoughts. But have we truly left that era behind? The marks of Cold War paranoia live on in modern surveillance, political schisms, and distrust of the media. Propaganda may have changed its form, but does it still dictate global narratives and public perception? Have we moved past the fear, or has it simply adapted to new battlegrounds? If the Cold War was a war of ideologies, how much of that ideological struggle still lingers in today's world? Are nations still using fear to control societies just as they did decades ago? And if history has taught us that narratives can be manipulated, how much of what we see and believe today is shaped by unseen forces? But ideology wasn't the only weapon. Another war was waged, not with missiles or spies, but with money, sanctions, and economic influence. Can financial power be just as devastating as military might? Has the balance of power truly shifted, or are we still playing the same game under a different name?